Two boats slide onto the same flat at first light. One carries a $1,500 screen glowing on the bow like an arcade cabinet. The other has a $150 unit clamped to the rail of a beat-up John boat. Both of them ping the same walleye sitting on the same rock in the same 20 feet of water. And here is the thing the tackle counter will never say out loud. The angler on the cheap boat drives home with a full cooler. The angler on the expensive boat drives home wondering why the fish he kept watching all afternoon never once opened its mouth. That gap has almost nothing to do with the price of the box. It has everything to do with what the two people staring at those screens can actually read. I have watched anglers do this for years. They save up, buy the biggest screen they can bolt to the boat, then sit there staring at it like it owes them a favor. Meanwhile, the quiet guy with the little bargain unit is bending a rod every 15 minutes. Same lake, same fish, wildly different day. So today we are going to do something the electronics aisle has no interest in you knowing. We are going to take the cheap fish finder you already own and turn it into a $1,500 fish finder. Not by upgrading the hardware, by upgrading the person holding it. By the time we are done, you will read your own screen better than most people ever learn to read the expensive one. And the single most valuable trick in this whole video sits right in the middle, and it costs you nothing but 2 minutes in a menu. Let me take you back to 1959. A family in Oklahoma, Carl Lowrance and his son Daryl, put the first practical portable fish finder into a regular angler's hands. They called it the Fish Locator. Everyone else called it the little green box. It was not a screen. It was a small round dial with a spinning neon bulb that blinked when the sound came back off the bottom or off a fish. That was the whole machine, a blinking light on a wheel. Now here is the part that ought to stop you cold. That little box sold for around $125 in 1959 money. Run that through inflation and you land near $1,200 today. So the very first fish finder ordinary people ever bought was, in real terms, almost exactly the expensive unit we are all told we cannot compete without. Over 1 million of them sold. 1 million anglers filled stringers reading a blinking light on a dial because they took the time to learn what that light was telling them. Daryl Lowrance was a physics student when he shrank that sound pulse small enough to tell a fish from the bottom. Real science, aimed at a real problem, decades before a color screen existed. And those anglers were not fumbling in the dark. Down in North Carolina, a high school physics teacher named Elwood Perry, the man the sport remembers as Buck Perry, had already proven something that still makes the industry uncomfortable. He was hauling giant bass out of deep open water every local had written off as dead empty lake, and he was doing it with no electronics at all, just a hunk of metal he bent into a lure in his garage, and a mind that understood where fish live and how they move between deep and shallow. The Bass Fishing Hall of Fame calls him the father of structure fishing. He did not find those fish with a screen. He found them with knowledge. The box just made that knowledge faster. Sit with that, because it is the spine of everything today. The fish were always findable. The screen is a shortcut, not a sixth sense. And a shortcut is worthless if you cannot read the map it hands you. So why does every fishing show, every sponsored boat, every glossy ad bury you under enormous screens? Because a screen is a product. It has a patent, a price tag, a slot on the shelf, and a shinier version already scheduled for next season. The skill of reading that screen has none of those things. Nobody can shrink-wrap learn to see and sell it to you every spring. So the industry hands you the glass, takes your money, and quietly leaves the seeing up to you. Most anglers never get there. That is the gap we are closing today, one setting at a time. Let us start with the single biggest lie your screen has ever told you. The fish arch. You know the shape. That smooth little rainbow, and every angler alive has been trained to jab a finger at it and announce, "There is a fish." Here is the truth that took me an embarrassingly long time to accept. That arch is not the shape of a fish. A bass is not built like a rainbow. The arch is a trick of geometry and timing, and the moment you understand how it is really drawn, half your confusion on the water evaporates. Picture the sound leaving the transducer on your hull. It does not shoot straight down in a thin line. It spreads into a cone, exactly like the beam of a flashlight aimed at the floor. Tight at the top, wide at the bottom. Now watch a fish, swim into the outer edge of that cone. At the edge, it is far from your transducer, so it paints low on the screen. As it slides toward the middle, it draws closer, and the mark climbs. When it passes directly beneath you, it is at its closest, and the mark peaks. Then it drifts to the far edge, gets farther away, and the mark sinks back down. Low, then high, then low. Let the screen scroll while that happens, and you have drawn an arch. The Discovery of Sound in the Sea project, run out of the University of Rhode Island, walks through it in exactly those terms, and the Boat US Foundation teaches it the same way. So the arch is really a little story about one fish crossing your cone while the clock ticks. And that has a consequence almost nobody bothers to tell you. If your boat is holding still, the fish never sweeps across the cone like that. It just hangs there beneath you. And a fish sitting still under a still boat does not paint an arch at all. It paints a flat line, a straight horizontal streak across your screen. Read that twice, because it explains 1,000 wasted afternoons. Anglers anchor up on a good spot, see flat lines instead of pretty arches, decide the fish have left, pull the anchor, and run. They were parked directly on top of a stack of fish the entire time. The pretty arch is a moving boat picture. The flat line is a sitting still picture. Same fish, two completely different stories. Learn to trust the flat line, and you will stop abandoning loaded spots. And that cone has one more secret the counter will never mention. It keeps getting wider the deeper it goes, which means the circle of water you are truly seeing is bigger than you picture, and it is not all sitting neatly under your feet. A common transducer fires a cone of about 20 degrees. At 30 feet of depth, that cone is roughly 11 feet across down on the bottom. Drop to 60 feet and it is over 20 feet wide. So when your screen shows a fish right under the boat, that fish might really be 5 or 6 feet off to the side, out past the edge of your hull. This is the real reason you mark a nice fish. Drop your jig straight down with total confidence and catch nothing. You were never on him. He was riding the edge of the cone the whole time, off your bow or off your beam. Start picturing your sonar as a wide circle of awareness instead of a laser pointer, and you will quit dropping your bait into empty water 3 feet from a fish. Now let me pull you out of the one setting that fools more anglers than anything else on the menu. Out of the box, most units run something called fish ident. It takes the raw, honest sonar and swaps the real marks for cute little cartoon fish symbols. It feels friendly, like the unit is doing the hard part for you. It is doing nothing of the sort. It is lying to your face. That feature cannot tell a walleye from a wad of milfoil. It stamps a fish icon on anything solid enough to bounce sound back. A stump, a clump of algae, a pocket of warmer water, your own jig on the drop, a downrigger ball. Guides who feed their families off this stuff treat that mode as an automatic no every time. The crew at Meat Eater flatly call it one of the only hard no's in all of fishing. So go into your menu tonight and switch it off. The screen will instantly look messier, and here is the beautiful part. That mess is the truth. Raw arches, raw lines, raw fuzzy clouds. That is you finally seeing what is down there, instead of a cartoon somebody drew to make you feel taken care of. That one toggle will teach you more in a single trip than a bigger screen teaches in a season. And notice, it is completely invisible on the shelf. There is no glowing product called honest mode. There is just a quiet switch the marketing department is praying you never find. Here is the one I promised you. The trick that turns a bargain finder into a real bottom-reading instrument, and it has been hiding in plain sight since those flasher days 60 years ago. It is called the double echo, or the second return, and it does two things at once. It tells you exactly how hard the bottom is, and it dials your unit into the perfect power setting. Both, for free, on hardware you already own. Here is what happens. Your sound leaves the transducer, hits the bottom, and bounces back to the boat. But a portion of it then ricochets off the underside of the surface, dives back down, smacks the bottom a second time, and only then returns. So a faint ghost of the bottom appears on your screen at exactly double the real depth. Sitting in 15 feet of water, a shadow bottom shows up down around 30. Now here is the read that fills coolers. Over a hard bottom, rock, gravel, packed clay, the sound comes screaming back strong, so that second echo is bold and bright. Over soft mud or muck, the bottom soaks the sound up like a sponge, so the second echo goes weak or vanishes. This is not campfire folklore. It is written right into the sonar patents. Hard bottoms throw powerful second and even third returns. Soft bottoms swallow them. So without spending $1, your cheap unit just became a bottom hardness detector. And a seam where hard bottom meets soft bottom is precisely the edge that walleye, smallmouth, and channel catfish patrol like a highway. But the double echo does one more thing, and this is why the old-timers loved it. It calibrates your sensitivity for you. Set your depth range to about double the actual water depth so you can see that ghost bottom. Then run your sensitivity up or down until the second return is just barely there, a thin, faint whisper of a line. If it glows like a bright yellow road, your power is too high and you are about to drown in false clutter. If it disappears, your power is too low and you are missing the soft returns that matter most. Single fish and the thermocline. Just barely visible is the sweet spot, every time. This is exactly how anglers tuned their flashers before you or I were born, and it works flawlessly on a $150 screen this weekend. That leads straight into the biggest single reason your cheap unit looks worse than it truly is: the auto setting. When a finder ships from the factory, it runs on automatic, and automatic, I am sorry to say, is a coward. It is tuned to hand you a calm, clean, foolproof picture that looks tidy in the showroom and never overwhelms a beginner. The trouble is that never overwhelm also means quietly erase the faint stuff. The small, loose bait cloud. The single, suspended crappie. The soft gray band of the thermocline where summer fish stack up by the thousand. Auto sees those weak returns, decides they are clutter, and wipes them off to keep everything pretty. So take it off auto. Push your sensitivity, your gain, up until you see a light, peppery speckle across the whole water column. That speckle looks like noise, and a sliver of it is, but it means you are now catching the weak returns too. The bait and the singles auto was hiding. Then, if a noise rejection or interference filter is turned up high, ease it down. Those filters do not politely remove only noise. They scrub out real, faint fish along with it. A cheap unit set up by hand will outread an expensive unit dozing on lazy factory auto. I will say it plainly, because it is the heart of this whole thing. The hardware was never your bottleneck. The settings were. And here is a bonus most bargain unit owners never realize they own. On plain two-dimensional sonar, you can watch your own lure fall, hold the boat over a spot, drop a jig, and watch a thin line sink down the water column on your screen. Now you can see in near real time whether your bait is above the fish, below them, or right in their face. You can even watch a mark rise up off the bottom to meet it. That is a slice of the same live-action magic everyone pays $1,500 for, running on the cheapest finder made, the moment you know to look for it. Now that you are seeing the truth, let me teach you to read it fast, the way a veteran guide reads it without a flicker of thought. Baitfish show up as a fuzzy cloud or a tight ball, a smudge of little dots and dashes suspended in the water. Find that cloud and celebrate, because where the bait hangs, the predators are never far. Your game fish, the bass, the walleye, the pike, print as bolder, thicker, sharper marks. Arches when you are moving, lines when you are still, usually parked just under the bait cloud or hugging its edge. The bottom line itself is talking to you too. A thick, bright, crisp bottom is hard, rock or gravel. A thin, dim, fuzzy bottom is soft mud. And your own boat speed shapes every mark. Drift at about 1 to 3 miles an hour, and single fish paint clean textbook arches. Race across and they smear into streaks. Sit dead still and they flatten into lines. None of that is the fish changing. It is you changing the picture. One last piece of free horsepower, buried in nearly every cheap unit ever built. Bottom lock, sometimes called bottom zoom. It pins the bottom flat across your screen and magnifies just a few feet directly above it, which happens to be exactly where walleye, catfish, and bottom-hugging bass spend most of their lives. On a normal view, a fish sitting 6 inches off a rock melts right into the bottom line and you never see him. Flip on bottom zoom and he separates out clean, floating there plain as day. Same fish, same cheap unit, an entirely different amount of information, purely because you told the screen where to look. So let me pull this back together. Buck Perry found offshore bass with no screen at all, armed with nothing but an understanding of structure and depth. The little green box put a blinking light on that knowledge and sold 1 million copies at what would be 1,200 of today's dollars. And every last thing we covered, the arch that is really geometry, the flat line that is really a fish, the fish symbol lie, the double echo, the gain, watching your lure fall, the bottom zoom, every bit of it runs on the cheapest real fish finder you can put in a boat. The $1,500 screen is not the thing standing between you and a good day. Your own two eyes are. Yes, the expensive unit does one honest thing a cheap one cannot: show you fish out in front of the boat in real time. If you fish tournaments for a paycheck, go buy it and fish it well. But for the rest of us, the fish could not care less how much your monitor cost. They care about one thing: whether the person holding the rod understands what the screen is trying to say. And notice this, because it is the quiet truth under all of it. None of what I taught you today has a patent. None of it has a shelf. Nobody earns a commission the day you finally learn to read your own cheap unit, which is the entire reason no one at the counter ever sat you down and taught you. Now you know it anyway. So tell me down in the comments, and be honest. Are you Team Auto or Team Manual? And after everything we just went through, do you still trust the fish arch? Or are you finally done believing in it the way I am? Drop the read that took you years to figure out, so the next angler scrolling by can steal it. One more thing before you go. I took every setting, every number, and a handful of extra tricks I did not have room for up here, and put them into a free written blueprint you can keep. The link is in the description, and the code is right there on your screen. It is yours, no charge, no catch. And wherever you fish, check your state and local regulations before you launch, because they shift from lake to lake and season to season, and knowing them is on you. I will see you on the water.